Welcome to Celtic State of Mind. I'm John Dykes, and today I am delighted to be joined by Victoria McNulty. Victoria, welcome to the show.
Hiya, thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. You're sitting next to a fellow poet in Kevin Graham. These are from the same kind of scene, the spoken word scene. Let's talk a wee bit about that. Hard times at the moment.
Yeah, indeed. Obviously, spoken word is a stage-based art form, and there is no stage performances going on in Scotland just now, so it's a wee bit of a limbo that a lot of performers are in, kind of waiting for the go-ahead to, run theatre shows, run live gigs, and how to work around that in the meantime. It's weird.
It's bound to be a bit weird, and I mean, when I speak to people who, for example, are comedians or they're in bands, you always talk about the great Scottish heritage of live entertainment, don't you? Yeah. A massive part of that is the scene that the guy to your left is into, and he's introduced me into a lot of that, because I probably didn't have any knowledge at all of the spoken word scene, if you would call it that, but Kevin's maybe enlightened me a wee bit. And as you say, it's gone from having a platform, and a very thriving, healthy platform for live entertainment in Scotland, to absolutely zilch. We had a comedian in here doing one of the other shows on A State of Mind a few weeks back, Kevin. I think you watched it. And he was talking about, the great comedians that have gone through that process of going into all these wee venues and all the different nights that became almost like go-to places as part of your development. And now the shutters have come down. Do you think, and I asked Edgar this yesterday, do you think enough's been done to try and safeguard arts and culture within this country?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I'm very aware that there's a necessary kind of protocol and precaution that needs to go in place just now to make sure that people can watch live theatre or live performance safely, but it doesn't seem to be happening. And if you think we went into lockdown in March, and now we're in a situation where nightclubs like the Sub Club are getting into difficulty, things that have been really established in the Scottish arts scene. No, I think nothing's been done, in fact, and it's we're going to see a knock-on effect to that, even at a grassroots level. I mean, you've just described comedians going around certain pubs, honing their craft. Where is a young poet going to do to learn how to have stagecraft or hold an audience at the moment? I don't think. I think we need to be looking at, I was in the pub on Friday, the pub was full, no social distance and very little precaution, and I'm like, I can go out for something to eat, but I can't watch someone playing an acoustic guitar. It just seems like it's been left to the side.
Doesn't make sense.
No.
Yeah, no, I'm not asking for a return to, going to watch Rage Against the Machine in a park and jumping about with 80,000 people, because that would be irresponsible. But if you can go for a meal, like you say, and you can go into a pub, and you've been able to go into the boozer for some time now, it seems very unusual that no live music can be part of that experience.
Yeah. I've never seen much hugging at a spoken word night anyway, or much motioned in the front or anything like that. There's all, and there was a spoken word day at the weekend there in Liverpool, and it was outside. Yep. They'd done it outside a pub on Bond Street. It was run by the guys with Violet Records. They run that. Is there anything like that going on in Glasgow, or is it just mainly online?
It seems to me mainly online, or what I'm aware of is online. Necessity pushed to establish nights online, and now because there's such an up in the air about I've heard, there's issues with funding and things up until March. Funding bodies are not wanting to put live performance on either, so it doesn't seem to be much. And I think also from a promoter's perspective, people are scared to break the rules or skirt round rules or do something that's perceived to be irresponsible, and they don't want to be that person where there's a coronavirus outbreak. It's something they've put on. And I totally understand that. So people are a bit scared, I think, to move forward.
Well, why do you think that the government, especially the British government, don't hold the arts and culture up as high as their education or something like that? Because we're both parents, and we really wanted the kids to go back to school because they need that sort of learning. They need they need other kids in that, but they also need culture.
Yeah.
The public also needs things to take their mind off, like what's actually happening in this world. So why do you think it always takes a back seat?
I think there's a few reasons for it. I think firstly people don't always understand to what extent they're consuming culture. And so if you really break it down, you know, you watch a box set on Netflix, that's art. You know, you buy a shirt with a nice print on it, well, you know what an artist made it. Your Celtic top that's all nice, somebody's designed that. You know, every album you listen to, but we do it so inherently every day that I think that people just think it's no there. You're just kind of, it's osmosis. And I think that there's a constant pull that I feel that I can observe between what is high art form and what is considered low culture. And I don't think that the likes of watching an acoustic like guitar act in a pub on a Sunday is very high up the list of the Scottish Government's priorities. You know, but that's down to what do we place value in, and maybe a lot of it's down to monetisation as well. You know, we get so much art for free, so we don't value it, so we don't fight for it.
That's really interesting, and I think that this lockdown, you mentioned earlier on, there was people doing streams for free. I think that was one of the reasons that we got you in here today, was to speak about the fanzine. And I'm now of the opinion, and I think it's lockdown that's made me bring this opinion, that art like spoken word and that should be performed and should be read, but should be physically read.
Yes.
I'm no longer a fan of it being put on blogs or websites or Instagram. It has to be, for somebody to get paid for their art, it's got to be in a physical form.
Yep.
And I say that with music as well. There's some things you hear now on a download, and you go, I want that physically in my hand. And I think that this lockdown's made me appreciate that more than what I did before it. Before it was just more, it was easy. Just to download something, watch something. You made a fantastic video, a horse fight. And check it out on YouTube. It was absolutely brilliant. But that showcased that's something that you want to see online. That's something, you used 2 bits of art there to create something magical. It was brilliant.
Thank you.
So I think I do think the physical has to come back out of this.
Do you think it will? Because I think you mentioned the music there, and you know, there was a time, Kevin, where somebody laughed at me the other week because I queued up outside the shop to buy an Oasis record on the day of release.
You're not on your own,
you know, and these things just don't happen now. And the fact of the matter is, now we've gone so far. So in the previous podcast earlier today, we were talking about Reserve League, and you know, we've gone too far and we'll never get back to having it because not enough clubs will be able to afford it. And I think it's the same way music. You know, music shops, retailers are closing down, and the pandemic, and when we get back to, and it's now being called the new normal, will there be any music stores? I mean, I used to walk down Rose Street in Edinburgh, and you know, you could go up to FOP. Back in the day, it was a once-a-month trip with my brother through to Edinburgh to Avalanche and places like that. And these places were already struggling prior to the pandemic. And it's so sad, to the point where your choices are limited. So even if you wanted to support the artist, I guess you could probably buy it direct, which would always be a good thing. We had, for example, Edgar Summertime in yesterday, and a lot of his releases have been on independent labels, so you buy direct, and a much larger part of the proceeds go directly to the company and the artist if they've got a good deal. Whereas back in the day, you know, remember Prince writing "slave" on his face, you know, because he was getting something like 8 pence a CD sale, And I think George Michael had the same issue, didn't he?
I think, though, for emerging artists who rely a lot on streaming services like Spotify and things, that is still the reality for them. I think Prince isn't, or George Michael's a different category, like financially, but I think for people who are touring bands or maybe unsigned bands, they're still getting 3 and 4 pence a tune.
Yeah. Oh, the streaming, the big thing again, talking to Edgar, he never mentioned it yesterday, but he has said to me before, back in the day, because he was on a major in the 1990s. Back in the day, you would tour to promote an album, but now you release an album to promote a tour.
Yes, absolutely.
Because there's no money in your music. You've got to go out and perform it. And that goes right back to the original point. If these musicians can't perform, they're making nothing or next to nothing, or relying on royalty checks, which are diminishing anyway, because we're entering a whole generation of, as you say, streaming, where you're getting 0.000 repeat to fade 1 pence a play, which just is outrageous.
I think as well, the streaming, I've noticed an increase in people asking people to donate to the streams. Like pay, if you were going to pay a £5 for this night, just pay as a £5. Do you think that's the way to go in certain times?
I think it's better than not doing it. I think, Bandcamp do Bandcamp Fridays and things at the moment. If you buy an album off that, you can guarantee it's going to go into the person who made its pocket at a grassroots level. My one worry about doing that kind of thing is that you then become in a situation where only artists who are popular make financial gain out of what they make. It's like the Arctic Monkeys MySpace scenario, and that worked out great for them. But, I guarantee there will have been loads of great bands who didn't have that exposure on the internet.
It's
a bit odd.
Spoiled with choice.
Aye, absolutely.
And you end up going down your own wee niche, and you just keep on feeding that niche as it goes there. I suppose we need to ask you about the fanzine. How did the fanzine come about?
The fanzine came about, during lockdown. I'd noticed this kind of garth and kind of gigs and things like that. I've always liked fanzines. I was into punk as a teenager. It was a big part of kind of punk culture. When I started performing, I was quite heavily platformed by a literary fanzine in Glasgow called The High Flight. Okay. Who some of the boys who ran The High Flight are now Speculative Books. So that's kind of how that's came through. But Chris McQueer also was performing in those stages, Leila Josephine, Kevin P. Gilday. So people who are now kind of known as writers had a fanzine. My first publication was in a fanzine, that fanzine. And I thought, so it's really important. It's important to have a kind of grassroots outlet. And then when I started to think about it, I thought, there's real barriers to working class writers being published. There's real barriers to visual artists who are making political art, all of these things. And I thought, I just want to make something that will showcase some of that, even if it's just for a small audience. I never thought big. I just thought just to get something out during lockdown. My friend Jo got involved in issue 1, and there was a music influence to it. And I'm happy just to kind of let it evolve as need be. But it was just to also, and to go back to what you were saying, some people like to have something in their hand. I've been surprised at the amount of folk that have said, send me a copy, because they want to just read a pamphlet, and to look at it.
I think that it's more personal, holding it than reading it on a screen. We spend our time so much in front of screens now. It's great to just have a step back and actually sit and read something physical, rather than just watch. Right? Even though you're reading it on the screen, it still feels like you're watching it.
I think
you're maybe not taking part.
No, you're right. You're right, because you're using the same device, aren't you? I think when it comes to reading, I don't do a hell of a lot of reading online. I read physical. When it comes to music, I thought about this other day. I'm now digital, completely digital, Kevin. I don't buy physical music at all. I did when I was in Edinburgh working, because it was accessible. walking from my work to the bus station, I could pop into one or two record shops and buy it, and I did buy it back then. So visual and audio, I consume it digitally, and it's just the accessibility. But I still have that relationship with the written word, where I want to buy, purchase and consume it a different way, which is part of the process, enjoying a good book that you never lose. So out of the three, and tell me if there's any other kind of elements of things that have been digitised in that respect, I definitely access my music and my film or TV digitally. But when it comes to literature, I prefer to have it in my hands.
I'm the same with you. The majority, all my music is now digital, mainly because I haven't got anything to play it on. And once my 2-year-old gets old enough to actually realise that he can't go near a record player, that is going to change.
Back out.
that is going to change. And
he's well behaved, Kevin. He was in here.
He was,
chapping on the window, looking for his dad, wearing the lime green Celtic away strip, which was lovely.
Nice. So I know that I'm going to go back to that. I've already told my wife that I'm going to go back to that. Mm-hmm. But at the moment, I'm fully digital. For somebody like myself, seeing my poem in print is far better than me posting it myself on a website. For me, sending it to you and you deeming it, and you and Joe deeming it good enough to go into a fanzine is, for me, far better than me just posting it on Twitter or something like that, or on my own website. And I know people have got to self-publish, but for me, it gives it a bit more of a value.
No, I think that from a practical point of view, as a writer, absolutely. I mean, you can self-publish if you like, but if you want to put a CV in to get like an internship or to apply for funding or any of these practical things that writers have to do, then they want to know where you've been published. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that getting published in a fanzine is going to win Creative Scotland over, but it's maybe a small... That process, as you say, sending it in and having people like it, it's a confidence boost for you then maybe to send it somewhere else next time.
Mm-hmm. I know what you're saying there. I mean, this is about me, but you've published that. The first poem I ever wrote, Jim McIntosh published it in Mind the Time. Yeah. That's where I discovered. That's the first time I ever read the first time I ever read your work was in Mind the Time. And I'm looking at it, I'm going, there's two established poets, Jim and yourself, have deemed my work good enough to actually get published. And that gives me a bit of confidence. And I'm sure there's a lot of writers in your fanzine just now who are maybe first time published. A couple of times published, they'll be going, wow, that gives me the confidence to do it again. To do it again.
Yep. And that's what it's about, really. And it's also to kind of showcase, this is what people have sent, this is what's out there. If you look, because there's always people who look, I mean, you guys will know you're really into music, you'll look for obscure music. People are the same with literature. If people read and deliberately try to find cool stuff, and I suppose it's back to that. That's what a fanzine is, isn't it?
When we talk about fanzine, it's a proper kind of punk movement, isn't it? Yeah. And then when you look at the Terraces, 1980s, I guess, and I know that there were earlier programmes, fanzines, Kevin, prior to that, but it became part of the football supporting culture in the 1980s, the fanzine culture. And it's something that Kevin and I have spoken to quite a lot of Celtic supporters about. So if we go back, I think we've always been pretty well served in the world of Celtic. If it was maybe 20 or 30 years ago and Kevin and I came up with an idea, it would have been a fanzine before it would have been a podcast, the Celtic State of Mind, But then I would have probably looked at what was happening around about Celtic and might have thought better of that because we were so well served in the world of fanzines. Was there any Celtic fanzines that piqued your interest back in the day?
Maybe of not a Celtic View. Like that was kind of
Pravda
around. But see, to be honest, I hate to say this, I think I'm maybe too young to remember fanzines being really heavily.
You don't have to hate to say that. You should be saying that with pride. Kevin and I, we can remember it like it was yesterday, but that's because we're old. But I loved Not the View, and I always name drop Not the View. That for me was the go-to Celtic fanzine. and it's still going strong, which again, I love the fact that it's going strong
and it's
as well.
still got that 1980s look about it. They've never bothered to change it.
I love when you go into a newsagent's and it's there beside the digger and you're just like, I'm going to buy them both. It's because, like you say, it looks like it's just been...
It was an education back in the day, because it wasn't, I mean, I would consume anything that had Celtic in it when I was a kid, and it was Shoot, Match, Roy the Rovers, the Celtic View, but I always subscribed to Not the View as well. And it was a bit grittier, funny, a bit risque compared to the kids' magazines that I was reading at the time, because I was a kid, I wasn't like 18 at the time, like, you know. But you're reading about the boardroom issues, Celtic should be going public. 1987, Celtic fans were writing about Celtic becoming a PLC.
Yeah.
You know, and it didn't happen for another 7 years.
Yeah.
But they had the foresight, and they, you know, that movement happened on the street level, and it never happened because of the fanzines, but the fanzines were a great vehicle for people getting that word out, and it created a revolution in the stands, you know, at Celtic Park, which inevitably ended up and culminating in Fergus McCann's takeover. The fanzine movement was powerful, you know, in football, and it's great that they're still able to survive, Kevin. I know you read them on a digital level, don't you? Fanzines to this day. I'm keen out of the scene when it comes to fanzines. So how healthy is the scene now, football wise?
I think there's a healthier scene now with quarterly publications,
Mm-hmm.
like in-depth, long-form writing.
Yep.
And I think there's a market out there, like you've got Nutmeg, Monday Owl before they've now actually went fully digital. The View fanzine as well. But it's interesting that Victoria says that they've like Chris McQueer, yourself, Kevin P. Goldie, all got the first break via an arts fanzine in Glasgow.
Yeah.
And these guys have went on to have speculative books
Yep.
as well. So I think there's maybe not a big, but it's like the vinyl revival, ain't it? I think there's people now going back to wanting to read magazines and have the physical thing. And the fanzine culture is still, it has to change, because everything, you can get your news and that all up to date instant now. So if you've got a monthly publication, you've got to make it worthwhile reading. Mm-hmm. And it can't just be topical, because it could be out of date by the time it goes out. So this is where I think the long form storytelling, in-depth stuff's coming in, because people want to read that. They can get their fix of in-depth on the news on their phone.
Absolutely.
But
or via the Axon Bulletin, Kevin.
Or via the Axon Bulletin.
Yes.
Right.
There's a zine library in Glasgow, the Glasgow Zine Library, if anybody's interested in looking more into that stuff, is a fantastic resource. It runs workshops and things like that for people making them. But the zines that seem to be going around are slightly maybe different from what you and I would consider a fanzine. They're maybe more visual based, or they're more personal. There's a lot of really great queer literature and things coming through stuff that wouldn't necessarily get published elsewhere, and it's given a voice to a specific subculture, just like punk. So it is still happening, and people still like to make them, and people make them in old printers and things, and the Pritt stick the way they used to. I can't be doing that. I'm not good enough to do any of that. But I think there's still a place for the thing that you fold out of your pocket and it's like a big poster of hand-drawn stuff. But yeah, I think it bridges that gap, doesn't it, between the quarterlies you're talking about. And
me and Paula spoke about that quite a bit when we were speaking where we wanted a Celtic State of Mind to go. And publishing either a magazine or a book has always been part of it, because we share that same sort of mindset, Paulie. That's
absolutely. I mean,
eventually we'll maybe do it, but it's always something that's been in the back of our minds. It's an age thing with us because of the ages, but it's like something. It's better to pick up something for us than just read it online or watch us online.
I think the point you make with this quarterly, or the magazine, it's almost like book worthy. It's so thick and well done, and the art that goes into the design and that kind of aspect of it, it becomes something that could be part of a series that you would want to complete the series. So as you're saying, Kevin, I tell you what, the guys at the Celtic media team have got a job to produce a magazine every single week at the moment, which is a view. It's a magazine based on Celtic news, what's happening at Celtic. So there's got to be a view of looking at how you can do it differently. Be that in-depth interviews, in-depth articles, which are almost investigative in their style. Celtic fans will still want to read that. I would always still want to read an interview with Bobby Gillespie, Richard Ashcroft, James Allen, Manny about Celtic. You know, I definitely would, or any movie maker, and if it's written well enough and in depth enough, then you would still buy and invest in that. I think it's difficult. It's going to be difficult for the club eventually to keep the Celtic View running, you know. And I've asked, obviously, they've got to give the answer that it will continue. It's the oldest club magazine in the world. And I think they're very proud of that, and quite rightly so. It was, innovative at the time. It was innovative for a long time. And, I think it hit a peak under Martin O'Neill in terms of sales, where they were up at 50,000, 60,000 a week, which is astonishing. But it'll be nowhere near that now. There's probably less than a tenth of that now buy it on a weekly basis.
Because you can get it at your fingertips.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's nice, going back to what you were talking about, like Celtic fanzines and stuff, a fanzine is a political publication. Even in the 80s, when people are talking about the Celtic board, that's a political act. You're attacking the structure of the team you support.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why that's better than online, because you can publish something in a bit of paper much easier. You put it on Twitter, then it's out there. You know, there's a bit of power in that. And the Celtic View, as much as it's well read and stuff, it's not that. It serves a different purpose than people collectively getting together and airing grievances or concerns about a specific structure or community.
Now, you mentioned political there. Obviously, your fanzine is called We Only Want the Earth, which is a quote by James Connolly. Yeah. So, tell us about how did that come about?
I just have always liked that quote. I admire James Connolly as a trade unionist and as a socialist. He's Scottish or Irish, depending on who you ask, you know. So, but I just like the idea. We want it all. We want everything, and it just came to my mind, and I used it. It's actually, from everybody that we've spoken to about it, you're the first person that's actually picked up what it was. I'm surprised the amount of folk we've managed to slide it past.
Slide that bit. I've maybe let the cat out of the bag there, so.
No, I mean, I assumed it was common knowledge, but I'm not sure it was.
I'm sure those of the sort of left-wing socialist persuasion would get it. I mean, as well... as I say, he first came to my attention in the Mind of Time anthology about football, and you wrote a poem in that about a romantic liaison with a Hibs casual on Leaf Walk.
Yeah.
How did you get into the writing poetry and the spoken word scene?
I wrote music. And I was writing music with lyrics with a friend, and he took unwell. And I was at an open mic night with my book of lyrics, and I read them. And I then started getting booked for poetry nights. I'd never called myself a poet or considered myself a poet in any shape or form. And it just kind of spiralled from there. And actually at the time I was just writing about my life. You know, I wasn't thinking about... So I fell into it. I was lucky.
So there was a Hibs casual?
There was a Hibs casual, aye, unfortunately, man.
James Connolly and Hibs casuals, it's all very... it's all going a bit Easter Road here, eh?
So I'm back to Glasgow, right, okay.
So you started going to the open night mics and that, and how... Was it just lyrics then you started writing? He says that you started writing about your life. Did you feel that the open night mics suited you, or did you feel that you were different, or that you were accepted? Because obviously you're from the East End of Glasgow. Yeah. So some of these spoken word nights can sometimes be seen as not working class. And maybe that's just a perception that people have got. I mean, it's maybe a perception that I've got, because I probably wouldn't have sent my poem in, not knowing it was you that was going to read it.
Yeah, and I think that I feel like that about things as well. There's certain people that I like to kind of gig with or work with because I know that they just get me. Like there's no kind of social divide between these. But in saying that, no, some open mics I went to were really inclusive. I mean, there was a cafe called The Blue Chair that I started performing that actually because it was bring your own booze and I could take my son. I didn't need to get a babysitter. And that sounds really simple, but that removed a massive barrier to me as a performer. I could get him a bit of cake, I could have a coffee and actually enjoy art and go home. A friend of mine also used to run a night called Feel Better in McCool's, which I used to go to anyway because it's a Celtic St Pauli pub in it. And it was absolutely, this night was chaotic. Like, it had all these different types of performers, some really high profile ones, some people just showing up. They were maybe on tour and playing later and they would show up with a guitar and, kind of sound out. And so those places were places I felt very comfortable, which was great because it meant by the time I was going into what was maybe not my comfort zone, I already felt ready as a performer to be myself. And I think it's really important to keep things like that going, actually.
Kevin, let's talk a wee bit about your appearances as a poet as well, because obviously we know that I forced you to recite some of your poetry in the last podcast. But, that's sometimes the best way, isn't it? Just get put on the spot. And that's exactly what happened to you at the Royal Concert Hall in front of how many? 1,500 punters?
1,500, yes.
So what happened that night? And I mean, that's going to basically remove any nervousness from you.
Well, it was a strange night. Obviously, that was a night that you didn't have any questions ready and I had to drive you through in the car.
Secrets coming out now,
So... No, that wasn't it. That wasn't that night.
That was another night.
That was another night. that one. That was. Folk think Paul was a professional in that, and he turned up to my house that night, and he went, "Do you know the way?" I went, He went, "No, can you drive? Because I've got any questions." He was only interviewing Neil Lennon and Chris Sutton. So, So
the interviews, they just run themselves, don't they?
Why?
So. Turned up to the Royal Concert Hall, and Kevin Miles, who you'll know, Celtic My Heart and My Soul, was meant to be doing the pre-gig entertainment.
But nobody told Kevin.
But nobody had told Kevin Miles. And there was a bit of a mix-up, and before I knew it, I had to get some stuff up on my phone, write it down, and I was going up onto the stage in front of 1,500 people to recite poetry when they were expecting Kevin Miles to come on and give them Hail, Hail the Celts, a big sing-song in that. It went down well. Most of my gigs have been like that, my first ever gig. But what was even stranger about that night was when I was standing behind the stage waiting to go on, I was with Jim Craig. And Jim Craig was checking the security guard's teeth because the security guard had a problem with one of his back teeth. And Jim's giving him dentist advice as I'm waiting to go on and recite poetry to 1,500 people. Yeah. So it was really quite surreal. Yeah. See, a husband lying giving somebody dentistry advice right now, even though Jim is a dentist.
I'm not even prepared for this.
I'm not prepared for this, and this is quite... My first ever night was at Broadcast, the launcher, Mind the Time. And I felt comfortable there because I'd been to Broadcast for gigs.
Yep.
So I knew the sort of thing. Then I just found it, and a couple of times I've done Celtic AM and Malone's. And that's just, I see it as a bit punk. Yeah. You're going into a pub with 50 or 60 guys who are there to see a guy with an acoustic guitar singing some songs, and I stand up and give him two poems, and it's the hush that you get. I get a buzz for that.
You should.
It's really good.
You should get a buzz. I mean, I think in the past, Kevin, you and I have spoken about that, how kind of risky it might have been to walk into a busy boozer on a Saturday afternoon, but, through thinking about that a wee bit more and analysing that, we're in among Celtic fans, so we probably shouldn't have had any concerns whatsoever that type of thing would be accepted, because I always think back to Celtic supporting families, for example, like my own, and it was all about art. it was all about singing and expressing yourself, and being a Celtic fan's always been about that. So maybe in a normal scenario, being in a boozer on match day would be daunting, but when you're among Celtic fans, I think we probably should have expected a good reception, and that's exactly what you got.
Maybe Victoria will maybe disagree with me or agree with me here, but I just see poems as short stories anyway.
Yeah.
And the Irish are a nation of storytellers.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely, it's not an unheard of thing to, have a family member that can recite something from start to finish, or sing a song really well, or play the tin whistle. So you standing up doing a poem about Celtic in a Celtic pub, it takes guts, but at the same time, people are already primed for it. They're with you anyway, because they like what you're doing and they already understand the spoken word. They maybe don't see it that way, but they do.
Is that a bit different with you in the spoken word nights? Because obviously you talk about East End life, you talk about sectarianism, you talk about stuff like that. So that sort of subject matter doesn't really come up in the spoken word scene.
I think people can still recognise that it's your truth, even although they maybe don't know exactly what you're talking about. They know where you're coming from. But you'd be surprised, actually, the amount of times you perform and people come up to you at the end and say, "Oh, I'm from there," or "I know what you're talking about." I mean, you mentioned that poem about the Hibs casual. I remember performing that in Deep in the West End of Glasgow, and I went outside for a cigarette, and this guy followed me out and showed me his Hibs season card. He's like, "Oh yes," and I thought, "Oh God," put that poem in the bin for a while. I'm like, I don't support them. So no, people, they get it. They do get a good story, as you say. But I've never performed in Malone's or something. I would love to perform at a Celtic pub or a Celtic function. And nobody's ever asked me.
Really?
Aye.
I'm surprised at that. I really am. And I think that once we get back to a stage where we can do it, then it's definitely going to happen, isn't it?
I don't know.
It would.
I'm just throwing it out there.
Definitely will
We'll
happen.
sort it out.
Definitely. There's loads of gigs that are kind of on hold.
Celtic State of Mind pre-match poetry somewhere in a pub before a game.
Why not? Right, we've had a few poets on here. We've had Kevin P. Gilday. We've had Aaron Boyle.
Aaron Boyle's been on as well.
We've also had Jim Leishman last week, but it wasn't a Celtic State of Mind, but he came and joined us in the studio and recited a poem about a coup.
All right.
So that was interesting. I think it was a 3-line poem. Kevin, did you hear it? The Cow in the Slaughterhouse.
Aye, I did, aye.
So yes, we do have a wealth of talent in that respect. As I said before, I've never written a poem in my life that I can remember. But you never know, I might write one of these days. If I ever get my pen and paper back out, I might do that at some point. I mentioned Kevin P. Gilday, talented young man, isn't he?
Aye. Kevin's probably one of my favourite kind of poets in Glasgow. I've been lucky enough to work with him before. I've done quite a lot with Sonnet Youth, and they directed my show Confessionals as well. So him and Kat Hepburn were the directors and producers for that. And he's just balls out, to be honest, isn't he? He just kind of just does it. He's one of the mad artists that he wrote a play for like an interactive spoken word show for the Fringe last year, and I'm like, I would never trust an audience to give me. I'd be terrified. And I've got a lot of admiration for that. He's a proper, his band, Kevin P. Gilday and the Glasgow Cross, excellent. Sonnet Youth, everything. That's such high quality nights they put on as well. And I think that anybody could watch and enjoy them, even although you might not think you like poetry or you don't recognise any name in the lineup. There's always something. And that's just a pure passion thing, I think, to kind of get that art form out there.
You see the mixture that they've got on them nights, and there's maybe not everything on it will be for you. But I went to the first one that they had in Stirling, and there was a guy there who was an illustrator, and he was talking over his own cartoons in the back while somebody was playing drone guitar.
Oh, wow.
And it was completely I was like, wow. I would never. If somebody would have said, "You're coming to watch that," I would have no. But when I was there, I was like, "That's really quite interesting." You mentioned Confessionals, so it says that you're a poet and that, but that was a stage show. That was a one-woman stage show.
Yeah, it was a spoken word show. Confessionals was published as basically a 20-page poem about the Gallagate. It was broken into 4 sections, but it had been the shell of a spoken word show for a feminist festival in Glasgow, and then published, and then Sonnet Youth produced it. And it was me and my friend Abby Normal, who is a Glaswegian folk musician. She kind of played the role of the busker in the pub, like the acoustic act in the kind of Celtic pub. And we turned the stage into an Irish bar and just acted out every character in the poem to poetry and her tunes. But when you describe that, like, to me, only Sonnet Youth could help you produce something like that. You know, the minute, Kevin Gildea right away was like, yep. And he encouraged you to be, like, he was like, what colour of light do you imagine here? And I'm like, that emerald green. And he's like, right, I'll write that down. Nobody told me no. And I thought, so it was a massive piece of work, but it was a total group effort, I think, in the end, to get that on tour.
Is Confessionals, can you still get that? It's on Speckliffe Books.
Yeah.
Is it back in print? I knew it was sold out for a while.
Yeah, I think it's on its third run now.
Yeah,
and I think it's on their website. I think it's £7 now on their website.
So it's basically about a night out in a pub in the East End, eh? Well, not a night out, but what happens?
It's about domestic violence, but it's about like how the personal violence is perpetuated by the violence of poverty and addiction, and a lot of it's kind of this football culture interspersed in it, because that's what my influence is, but also as a young woman submerged in that culture. I'm not a young woman now, but that's where I take a lot of my influence. In a lot of ways it was misogynist, and it was rough, and it was quite like jarring at times, and I wanted to write about that. I wanted to write, these are the characters that you encounter, and these are the kind of things that this is how it feels like to stand. Because sometimes I used to feel, when I was younger, say I'd been to a game and I'd went to the pub after it, I used to feel like I was on the outskirts, and it was just, I just wrote what I'd observed and hoped, and other people recognised it as being their truth as well. It wasn't just me.
The other poem in Mind of Time actually captures that, because you've got 2, 3 poems in Mind of Time, was it?
I might have. I remember sending 2.
I haven't seen Confessionals, but I've seen video clips of it, and it looks really, really, really powerful. And how did that was that not daunting for you to say, right, you're going to do this 45 or however long it is, and it's just going to be you and Abby on the stage, and you're going to need to remember all your words?
Aye, it was massive, and we had rehearsals before it, and I was going home at night, and I could hear like Kevin and Kat's voice in my head when I was in bed at night, going, do this, move here, blah, blah, blah. And I'd never done anything like that before, but it was so empowering, because we took it on tour. Like, so it was two friends, 2 women on tour, in their green Adidas trackies, like telling everybody about Celtic and the Gallagate, and it was brilliant. It was worth the effort because of the whole experience of it.
Didn't put you off because you've done it again, eh? The Exiles.
I don't know what's going to happen with Exiles, because obviously the coronavirus thing kind of but we did run a short kind of version of that before Christmas. The Exiles is going to be published by Speculative Books in October as a full collection of like essays and poems connected to that. I would love to turn it into a show somehow, but I don't know how I would do it just now.
What's the themes in Exiles? It's exactly what it says in the title, or
it's kind of made up of like poetry and essays, and the poetry tells a story of a couple who kind of become involved in the Iraq War, or the kind of post-Iraq War. One of them signs up for the army, and it kind of plays out. But the essays are about Glasgow. They're about the gentrification of Glasgow, and like Glasgow becoming this new alien city. Because I felt very quickly after the Commonwealth Games, I thought I didn't recognise this place anymore. I don't belong here anymore, and that's where the name came from. I felt an exile in
your own city.
My own city.
That's it's us being Celtic fans as well. You notice the change round about Celtic Park, and when I went in the 1980s, it's a completely different place now. And you'll remember that time, Paul, we had the guys up for the Anfield Wrap. Now, if you ever been to Anfield, Anfield still got all the terraced houses round about it,
right?
And it's still.
I was there Saturday. I was at Anfield on Saturday.
I thought Edgar was a Everton fan.
Aye, but I drove to Anfield and then phoned them to say, where do you live? It was just a nice place to go, and just round the corner actually is where he was, so I was down there.
And the guys for the Anfield Wrap couldn't believe the amount of space that was round about Celtic Park. And I says to them, well, never used to be like this. There used to be a railway bridge down there, there used to be tenements all round about here, and it's just funny how things have changed and how Glasgow's decided to change the East End, especially with the Commonwealth Games. You've mentioned Celtic, so question we always ask, it's great to do a Celtic State of Mind interview again, Paul. I probably haven't done one since December.
It's been a while.
It's been a while since.
It's been a while, Kevin, since
one,
you... Yes, probably the toll booth would have been the last one.
Toll booth, aye. So what was your Celtic team growing up then? Or the first Celtic team that you fell in love with?
A big think about this, and I think it's probably really controversial to say it. I'm sure it'll be poo-hooed, but that kind of round about 2006 era Celtic squad, the kind of Petrov and Lennon, Boric, that kind of thing. But it's purely probably because that's when I was going to football regularly. It was also a time when, you didn't necessarily know who was going to win the league for 1 year to the next, so you were hooked and invested for the offset, But it was just, I was old enough to have disposable income to go to it, but young enough to pure throw myself into it. And I still have a soft spot for that squad in that era.
Any team that contains Nakamura
absolutely
deserves a special mention. Nakamura were quite whatever that word is, people.
Aye.
And Nakamura he was an artist.
Absolutely.
I asked Kevin this question when he was in, and I think I asked Aaron Boyle it as well. Any Celtic player you think could have been a poet? You looked at them and went, I think Nakamura could have been a poet. I could see him sitting there writing.
That's a huge question.
Are you thinking intellectually, Kevin, or just visually? Did he look like a poet?
Just visually.
Right.
Or maybe even, Arthur Borat looks like a heavy metal drummer.
Paddy McCourt. I would go to see Paddy McCourt perform spoken word like that. He's mad kind of... Well, the way he looked when he played for Celtic, kind of mad.
That's a great shout, because so many great poets are Irish, and great writers, and great lyricists. So, brilliant. Love it.
I can see what you're meaning with when he had the big long hair. And I get that.
And I could just imagine him just being a bit drunk at the mic and a bit wide and just a wee bit hot, maybe. And I would totally go and see Paddy McCourt.
I'd pay to see that.
Aye, totally.
I'd say to see that. I mean, and he was, he was poetry in motion. He was, artistic as a player and all this kind of stuff that you could say. McCourt would fit that bill. What was your suggestion, Kevin, when you posed that question before?
Oh, Samaras, eh?
I think you did say Samaras.
Samaras was like quite a easy answer, really.
Yeah.
Because of the long hair and the fact that he went in the huff quite a lot. And,
dramatic, absolutely.
He's extremely dramatic.
Did Sammy go in the huff?
Well,
he just had that unfortunate knacky looking like he was always in the huff.
As soon as he put that snood on, you knew that was it. Game over. He wasn't going to play until spring came about again.
That's right.
Samaras, right? So he probably had the kind of the mystique and the look of a poet, didn't he? I'm not sure who else. I'm thinking Cantona, right? Because obviously he told a very he was quite poetic, didn't he? Okay. And he recited a wee line of poetry that will go down in the history books, football culture. I'm pretty sure. I don't think, have we had somebody like that playing for Celtic? Because a genius, but also a cult. A genius who didn't do what was expected.
I don't know if a genius, but I do think Arthur Boric was a cult figure. A fan favourite. He felt like a genius at the time, and then it seemed to go very wrong at times as well.
But it should be that with all geniuses. There should be a line that they can either fall off. Zidane, perfect example. Like, always got that bit of mentalness in them.
I'm trying to think, like, who else, or think further back, actually.
I'm trying to think of... My unconscious bias is putting me to the French players. I'm trying to think of the French players who would maybe be...
Stephen Mahé, there you go. There's your poet right there. Yep, just imagine it, Kevin. Stephen Mahé. He could be a poet, he could be a painter. All of the above.
I want to say...
Enrique only drives big motorbikes and he's a Hell's Angel. He's not a poet.
That's a good point. I want to withdraw Arthur Boric now for that mix. Now you've said that.
When we spoke to Kevin McDermott, I said I could see Arthur Boric as a death metal drummer in a death metal band, and just battering the living daylights of a set of drums.
He'd be a roadie that would also like double up as a bodyguard, I think. Right. Arthur Boric. Now, Victoria, it's been an absolute pleasure for you to come along, and I threw Kevin under the bus before to recite some of his poetry. I believe you want to recite some poetry yourself.
Yeah, I would like to recite a poem by Stephen Watt that is in our fanzine, just because I think it fits the theme, and I just love it. I love Stephen Watt. He's a great kind of poet, but he writes a lot of really good football poetry as well. He's
Dumbarton's poet in residency
and things. So I wanted to read it, and it's called Frisk. Here we go, the yellow day-glow heroes of the stadium. They form a lemon obstruction between us and hedonism. Green glass inside black cotton, the quarter bottle resting against my left shin. It forms a padded square covering that any amateur could detect. And yet, this pat-down, rub-down, tender examination neglects to root out the reason for my effervescent eyes, weaving wonder, hiccuping expression. He seems to be enjoying this. My piss kisser is a red flag, scumbags, odds stacked against me being permitted access. I'm the equivalent of a backpack jihadi maniac. But then he steps back, and it becomes bliss. Olympic white floodlights the stadium, a quilt and tartan tarmac, and when one hand grabs my right leg. What's this? He quizzes, and my spirit vanishes. The master plan sags when today's frisker exposes my overlooked ankle tag.
Well done.
Brilliant, that's great, Stephen.
Listen, thanks to everybody who has tuned in to watch us on A Celtic State of Mind. Kevin Graham has made a welcome return to the show that made A Celtic State of Mind a name for itself back in the day, where we would bring someone along from the world of the arts and speak to them about their love of Celtic. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, Victoria, and stay in touch.
No worries, thank you very much.
Thank you.